My parents laughed when I said I couldn't afford rent after my daughter was born. "You're a man, figure it out." Then they turned my old room into a home theater. I took my baby and left. They had no idea where I went or who I'd become. I, 29 was standing in my childhood living room, bouncing my 3-week-old daughter against my chest at 2 in the morning, trying to keep her quiet while my parents slept upstairs. The apartment my wife and I had been renting sent an eviction notice 2 days after we brought our baby home from the hospital. My wife had complications during delivery, spent a week in the ICU, and the medical bills buried us. I worked in IT support making decent money, but decent doesn't cover a medical emergency and rent in the same month. I went to my parents because I thought family meant something. I thought the people who raised me would help when I had a newborn and a wife still recovering from nearly dying. My father opened the door in his bathrobe, annoyed that I'd shown up so late. I apologized but explained the situation quickly. We just needed a place to stay for a few months while I sorted out the finances, maybe my old room, just temporary. My mother came down the stairs, tying her robe, asking what all the fuss was about. When I finished explaining, my father actually laughed. Not a nervous laugh, but a genuine amused chuckle like I'd told a joke. He said I was a man now and men figured things out. My mother nodded along, saying they'd raised me to be independent and this was part of being an adult. I asked if we could at least stay a few weeks, just until my wife was strong enough to go back to work. My father shook his head and said they had plans for my old room. They were converting it into a home theater, something they'd wanted for years. The equipment was being delivered next week. I stood there holding my daughter, feeling something crack inside my chest. My mother noticed my expression and softened slightly, saying they could lend me $1,000, but that was it. $1,000 wouldn't cover first month, last month, and deposit anywhere. I told them that, and my father's face hardened. He said if I'd been more responsible with money, I wouldn't be in this position. He didn't want to hear excuses about medical bills because everyone had problems. I left without taking the money. My wife was waiting in the car, pale and exhausted, asking what they said. I told her we'd figure it out, my voice hollow. We slept in the car that night in a grocery store parking lot, the baby between us and her carrier. My wife cried quietly, and I pretended not to notice because I didn't know what to say. The next morning I called my college roommate, who'd moved to another state for work. He'd always said I could visit anytime. I asked if that offer was still open and explained everything. He didn't hesitate. He said we could stay as long as we needed, that he had a spare bedroom and his wife would love to help with the baby. We drove 14 hours straight, everything we owned packed into our sedan. His generosity gave me space to breathe and think. My wife recovered slowly, and I picked up freelance work online while keeping my day job remote. My friend's wife was a nurse and checked on my wife daily, making sure she was healing properly. They treated us like family, never once making us feel like a burden. It was the kindness my own parents should have shown. I worked like a machine those first months. Mornings I did my regular IT job, afternoons I took freelance contracts, nights I learned coding and started building websites for small businesses. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. My wife noticed how thin I was getting, how my eyes had dark circles, but she understood. We both did what we had to do. My parents called twice in the first month. Both times my mother asked when we were coming back, saying they missed their granddaughter. She didn't ask how we were doing or where we were staying. She talked about the new home theater, how amazing the sound system was, how my father watched movies every night. I kept the conversations short and didn't tell them where we were. 6 months passed. My freelance work turned into something bigger. A client I'd built a website for ran a mid-sized tech company and was impressed with my work. He offered me a position as a project manager with a salary that doubled what I'd been making. We moved into our own apartment, small but clean, and my wife went back to work part-time. Life started feeling stable for the first time since our daughter was born. I didn't contact my parents. They'd call occasionally, and I'd answer but keep things vague. My mother would ask about seeing the baby, and I'd say we were busy, maybe soon. My father never asked about our situation or if we needed anything. The conversations felt transactional, like checking a box. A year went by, then 2. The tech company promoted me to senior project manager, then director of operations. I was making more money than I'd ever imagined, and we bought a house in a good neighborhood with a yard for our daughter. My wife finished her nursing degree and got a job at a hospital nearby. We were doing more than surviving. We were thriving. My parents didn't know any of this. To them, I was still their struggling son who couldn't manage his finances. My mother's calls became less frequent, maybe once every few months. Always the same questions about when they could visit. I always had an excuse ready. 3 years after that night, I stood in their living room holding my newborn. My company went public. My shares were suddenly worth a substantial amount. Not billionaire money, but enough that I never had to worry about rent or medical bills again. The local business journal did a profile on me, talking about how I'd built my career from nothing. My friend who'd taken us and sent me the article, joking that I was famous now. 2 days after the article published, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. My mother, voice excited, saying she'd just seen the article. A friend had sent it to her, and she couldn't believe it. She said she was so proud, that she always knew I'd do well, that she'd love to visit and see the house and spend time with her granddaughter who she barely knew. My father got on the phone and said essentially the same things, adding that family should stick together and we should visit more often. I felt nothing hearing their words. No anger, no satisfaction, just a flat emptiness. I told my mother we'd talk later and hung up. My wife found me sitting in the kitchen, staring at my phone. She asked what was wrong, and I explained the call. She'd met my parents exactly once, that night in the car after they'd turned us away, and she'd heard every story since. She sat down across from me and asked what I wanted to do. I didn't have an answer yet. My daughter, now 3 years old, ran into the kitchen asking for breakfast. She was happy and healthy and had no memory of sleeping in a car or being homeless. That was what mattered. I'd built a life for her where she'd never feel the desperation I'd felt. My parents called again that afternoon, then the next day, then the day after. My mother left voicemails talking about family being important, about how much they'd love to be part of their granddaughter's life. My father sent a text saying we should let bygones be bygones, that everyone made mistakes, that family forgave each other. I blocked both their numbers for a week because I needed time to think without their voices in my head. My wife said whatever I decided, she'd support. My friend, the one who'd taken us in, said I didn't owe them anything, that blood didn't excuse cruelty. But the decision felt heavier than that. After the week, I unblocked their numbers and called my mother. She answered immediately, relief in her voice. She started talking quickly about planning a visit. Maybe they could come next month. They'd love to take their granddaughter to the park. I interrupted and asked if she remembered that night 3 years ago. The silence on the other end was long. Finally, she said of course she remembered, but that was in the past. I asked if she remembered what my father said, about me being a man who needed to figure it out. Another pause. She said they'd been stressed, that they didn't realize how serious our situation was. I asked about the home theater, if they still had it. She said yes, though they barely used it anymore. The defensive tone in her voice told me she knew where this was going. I told her I'd figured it out, just like my father said I should. I'd figured out how to survive, how to build a career, how to provide for my family without them. I'd figured out that the people who were supposed to help me when I was drowning had chosen a sound system instead. My mother started crying, saying they'd made a mistake, that they were sorry, that parents weren't perfect. I told her I believed she was sorry, but being sorry didn't change what happened. It didn't change sleeping in a car with a newborn. It didn't change my wife crying because she felt like a failure when the failure was never hers. It didn't change me working 18-hour days because I had no safety net. Being sorry was easy now that I'd succeeded despite them, not because of them. My mother asked what she could do to make it right. I told her there was nothing to do. I wasn't calling for revenge or to hurt her. I was calling to let her know that the son she'd turned away had become someone she no longer knew. That the granddaughter she wanted to see was surrounded by people who'd actually been there when it mattered. That my wife had a family now through my friend and his wife, who'd shown up when blood relatives hadn't. She asked if I'd ever forgive them. I said maybe someday, but forgiveness didn't mean things went back to how they were. It didn't mean access to my life or my daughter. It meant I'd stop carrying anger, but that was for me, not for them. My father got on the phone and asked what I wanted from them. Money? An apology? I told him I didn't want anything, and that was the point. I didn't need anything from them anymore. He called me ungrateful, said they'd raised me, and I owed them respect. I laughed, and it surprised both of us. I told him respect was earned, not owed, and turning away your son when he needed help wasn't respectable. I asked if he enjoyed the home theater, if it was worth it. He hung up on me. My mother called back an hour later, alone this time. She apologized again, more genuinely, admitting they'd been wrong. She said she thought about that night often, that she regretted how they'd handled it. I believed her this time. I told her I appreciated the apology, but it didn't change my decision. She asked if she'd ever meet her granddaughter properly. I said maybe when my daughter was old enough to decide for herself if she wanted that relationship. Until then, I needed to protect my family the way no one had protected us. She accepted that, though I could hear how much it hurt. We agreed to exchange holiday cards and occasional updates, nothing more. It felt like closing a book I'd been carrying for years. Update 1. 6 months after that phone call, my father had a heart attack. Not fatal, but serious enough that my mother called from the hospital. Her voice was small and scared, asking if I could come. I told her I'd think about it, and hung up. My wife asked what I was going to do, and I didn't know. My daughter was in preschool now, bright and curious, asking questions about everything. She'd asked about grandparents before because her friends talked about theirs. I told her she had grandparents, but they lived far away. It was easier than the truth. I drove to the hospital alone, a 5-hour trip back to the city I'd left. My father was sleeping when I arrived, looking older and smaller than I remembered. My mother hugged me, and I let her, feeling awkward. She thanked me for coming and said it meant everything. We sat in uncomfortable chairs while my father slept. My mother talked about his health, the doctor's recommendations, how scared she'd been. I listened without saying much. Eventually, she asked about my daughter, what she was like. I pulled out my phone and showed her pictures. My mother cried looking at them, saying she was beautiful, that she had my eyes. My father woke up and saw me sitting there. His expression was complicated, something between surprise and shame. He asked why I'd come, and I told him I didn't know, that maybe some part of me still cared despite everything. He nodded slowly and said he'd been thinking about what I'd said on the phone, that I was right. The words came out difficult, like pulling teeth, but they came. He said the home theater sat and used most days, that every time he looked at it he thought about that night, that he'd been proud and stupid and had convinced himself he was teaching me a lesson about self-reliance when really he'd just failed as a father. My mother was crying again, but I felt oddly calm. I told him I appreciated the honesty, but it didn't fix anything. He said he knew that, and he wasn't asking for it to. He just wanted me to know he was sorry, and he understood if that wasn't enough. We sat in silence for a while, and then I left. I didn't visit again while he recovered, but I called my mother weekly to check on his progress. She seemed grateful for even that small connection. My wife asked if I felt better after seeing them, and I said I felt different, like a weight had shifted but not disappeared. Update 2. A year later, my daughter turned 5. We threw a birthday party in our backyard with her preschool friends and the people who'd become our real family. My friend who'd taken us and was there with his wife and their 2 kids. My wife's coworkers came, the ones who'd become her closest friends. It was loud and chaotic and perfect. My mother sent a card with a check for a substantial amount and a note saying she wished she could be there. I didn't cash the check, but I did send her a thank you card with pictures from the party. She called after receiving it, her voice thick with emotion, thanking me for the photos. She didn't ask to visit, and I appreciated that. My father sent a separate card, shorter, saying he hoped my daughter had a good birthday. It was the first time he'd acknowledged her directly since everything happened. It felt significant, even if small. My daughter asked who the cards were from, and I told her they were from my parents. She asked if she'd ever meet them, and I said maybe someday when she was older. She accepted this easily the way kids do and ran off to play with her new toys. My wife squeezed my hand, and we watched our daughter play in the yard we owned, in the life we'd built from nothing. I'd never forget what happened, and I'd never let them pretend it didn't matter. But I also wasn't consumed by it anymore. I'd proven what I needed to prove, to them and to myself. I'd become someone they didn't recognize, someone who didn't need their approval or their help. The man standing in their living room holding a newborn and begging for help was gone. In his place was someone stronger, someone who'd learned that family wasn't always blood, and that success was the best response to being underestimated. My parents would always be part of my history, but they weren't part of my present, and that was a choice I'd made consciously. Maybe one day that would change, but it would be on my terms, when and if I decided they'd earned it. Until then, I had a life full of people who'd shown up when it mattered, and a daughter who'd never know what it felt like to be turned away by the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. That was enough. That was everything.